the New York Times, and the title of the piece is "Thousands Believe COVID Vaccines Harmed Them. Is anyone listening?" Now that sounds like it is the final, the straw that broke the camel's back, and finally the New York Times is going to reverse course, and the gaslighting of the vaccine injured is finally over because the New York Times is calling attention to it. That is not what this article is at all. And in fact, I'm going to argue this article isn't even bullshit because, frankly, if you grow up on a farm, bullshit just isn't that terrible, right? This is ape shit. And what the article does is it engages with a radically different tone while selling us the exact story that persisted throughout the vaccine portion of the so-called pandemic. Right? Thousands believe COVID vaccines have harmed them. That is such a crazy number, especially to show up here in the title, right? Because billions were vaccinated with these things. And so those who were in any way sophisticated were saying, well, of course, all vaccines result in a tiny amount of injury, but it's really very small. And so in any case, this is no admission at all because the number is certainly in the millions. That's one thing. And I will say, if you want an exhaustive exploration of this article, I would recommend that you look at what Chris Martenson released. He goes through the article and he covers most of the highly relevant points.
And we'll post that as well.
Yep, we will post that as well. But I wanted to make 2 points that Chris doesn't make that I thought were relevant to the way we've been exploring the issue of vaccine safety and effectiveness, because they belong on the record here as the New York Times attempts to regain control of a story that has been officially lost, right? Everybody is aware of people who were injured. We know multiple people who we knew from before the COVID era.
But there's a selective bias there.
I don't know that there's a selective bias in the group of people before the COVID era. We know people who were injured, who we knew in person before the COVID era, who have been injured in the COVID era. So that's a shocking fact. Now, we may have a larger friend group than many in even before the COVID era began, but nonetheless, it is an interesting fact that we know multiple people who clearly have vaccine injuries and knew them beforehand. That tells you what order of magnitude we're looking at here.
Yep.
Okay, so the 2 points that I wanted to call attention to are, one, that one of the ways that this story has been kept from attaining its rightful importance is that the mechanism by which damage flows from the mRNA shots, and I will say that this article, as Chris explains in his piece, the article makes a point right in the first sentence of calling attention to the Johnson & Johnson shot, which is based on a different technology. It's based on an adenovirus vectored DNA,
and the powers that be were going after the J&J shot from the beginning. Yeah,
there's a story yet to be told. And I would also point, we covered more than a year ago now, Christine Stable-Ben's work in which she finds that the DNA-based shots actually have a non-specific beneficial effect, small, but a non-specific beneficial effect, very much in contrast to the mRNA shots. All right, the mRNA shots have multiple design defects. The mRNA isn't mRNA. It's a highly modified, highly stabilized molecule that is not ephemeral in the body. It persists for a very long period of time. In fact, we don't even know how long it persists. But the point I wanted to make is the hypothesis, which I have explored extensively, which is that the mRNAs, which are injected in lipid nanoparticle coating, that lipid nanoparticle has no specificity in terms of what tissues, the cells of which it can enter. which means that as soon as we know that the stuff circulates around the body in blood and lymph, what you would predict is arbitrary destruction of tissues. You would predict effectively arbitrary disease, because what happens is the mRNA gets into whatever cells pick up the lipid nanoparticle. It causes those cells to produce a protein that is foreign, and the immune system cannot help but recognize a cell of yours that produces a foreign protein as virally infected, and they then destroy it. So you would, the argument here is that we've got a disease which is your own immune system, CD4 cells, natural killer cells, destroying your own tissues. What disease do you expect? Depends what tissues are being destroyed. Depends which cells within those tissues are being destroyed. Depends how many different tissues have been destroyed. So you would expect a huge number of pathologies. And of course, the mRNA shots do show a huge range of pathology. If that was, if that was one tissue that was getting all of the damage from the shot, we would be having a different conversation. But because it's disguised as basically, amorphous blob of dysfunctions where, two people injured by the same shot from the same lot may have, dysfunction in very different tissues of the body, very different functions, that is hiding the level of damage, because the story isn't, person took the shot and had this disease. Mm-hmm. It's person took the shot and had some effect. So it is basically by dividing the effect into all of these tiny little subcategories, it is hiding it. And even then, what we have is an overwhelming story of pathology.
Yep.
In interviews and email exchanges conducted over several months, federal health officials insisted that serious side effects were extremely rare, and their surveillance efforts were more than sufficient to detect patterns of adverse events. Well, that is insane in and of itself. Okay, there was a massive safety signal in the VAERS database. Steve Kirsch, very much to his credit, kept pressing federal officials. At what level of safety signal would you pull these shots from the market? And he got back nothing of any merit. So what we know, and we know from multiple lines of evidence, that the safety signal that did accumulate was being ignored. So we have a system. That system is designed not to spot safety signals. It saw a massive safety signal, and nobody reacted to it. So the idea that our efforts were more than sufficient is insane. Okay, but then here's the paragraph that I wanted to focus on. This is a quote. Hundreds of millions of people in the United States have safely received COVID vaccines under the most intense safety monitoring in U.S. history, end quote. Jeff Nesbitt, a spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services, said in an emailed statement. Now, it's hard to even describe how insane that paragraph is. Right? Hundreds of millions of people in the United States have safely received COVID vaccines under the most intense safety monitoring in U.S. history. First of all, this was the worst case of safety monitoring in U.S. history. I don't think there's even a close second. But that's the less troubling part of this statement. The more troubling part is the absolute destruction of the meaning of the word safely. Now, I believe you and I are responsible for sorting out the abuse of this word over the course of COVID. And what we have been saying from very early in this process is that safe does not mean without harm. Safe means without risk. Mm-hmm. And it is being used to say hundreds of millions of people in the United States have safely received COVID vaccines. Well, is that true? I did some calculations, and what I came up with is the number of people who safely received these vaccines was 0. Mm-hmm. Why? Because nobody knew how dangerous they were, or if they did, then they knew they were very dangerous. So what does it mean to say hundreds of millions of people have safely received COVID vaccines? What they're trying to say, or what they intend to convey, is that hundreds of millions of people seem to have endured no harm. Mm-hmm. We don't know that they endured no harm because they may have subclinical pathologies, or they may not have gone to a doctor and decided to tough it out themselves, given that the doctor was involved in inflicting the harm in the first place. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out, if I say that tens of thousands of people have safely jumped from incredible heights wearing a squirrel suit, right? You know something's wrong. Nobody safely jumps from an incredible height, right? Even if most of those people do make it back to terra firma alive and well, right? Unharmed. The point is, it wasn't safe. If I say that tens of millions of Americans safely drive drunk every year, no, they don't, right? They may get home. They may not bump into anything, but they're not safely driving drunk. They are driving drunk without causing harm, right? So the point is, no, they were taking a massive risk doing that, and we all know it, right? If I
People getting lucky is not a public health policy.
Right, it's not a public health policy. If I say that 83% of people who play Russian roulette do so safely, well, no. Actually, nobody has ever played Russian roulette safely, right? Not a one.
Yep.
Right? It doesn't matter that 5 and 6 walk away from the experience. So to have the New York Times conflating this intentionally to try to lead us to the understanding, which is, again, not a change from the bullshit that they were selling us for the entire vaccine portion of the pandemic, which is that, oh my God, there are some side effects and isn't that tragic? But the vaccines, as the article says, have done all of this, protecting of people, which they didn't, right? That turns out to have been a sleight of hand accomplished through what has been called the cheap trick by Norman Fenton and Martin Neal. So to have them doing this is clearly an exercise in trying to regain control of the story while admitting nothing but switching the tone so that people who are not paying terribly close attention believe that, yes, the story has moved on and we all now know about the injuries. But the point is, what's missing is the correct order of magnitude. Are we talking about thousands or are we talking about millions?
Yeah. And the author of this piece, Apurva Mandavili, I may be mispronouncing her name, but she's one of the most useful idiots the New York Times and the whole COVID infrastructure have. She has, as Chris Martenson says in his piece, she has been responsible for misdirection and actual misinformation consistently throughout. And it says at the top here that she spent more than a year researching this article, talking to dozens of people. And my feeling is, even if that were true, which frankly I don't believe.
Yeah.
This article is garbage. It's appallingly bad, and it is also timely, right? Like these are people. The officials are reflecting back on how awesome they did, except for these little mistakes, which is egregious. But this is a moving story. You can't report a moving story over the course of a year. And God, I'm just appalled at what is passing for journalism.
Yeah, what is passing for journalism, indeed. I also had a thought about multiple stories that are getting a revision. Right. Mm-hmm. I believe that the truth is that those of us who couldn't be shouted down and who managed to have this conversation in public forced a reckoning where they now have to get back ahead of the story because they look ridiculous. But that there's also, it is interesting to see that the repurposed drug story is getting a revision. The new protease inhibitor drugs, molnupiravir and remdesivir, is getting a revision, and the lab leak is getting a revision in the other direction. And in fact, the author of this story was one of the people who dismissed lab leak early on and continued to.
Yeah, as Chris Martenson reminds us, for being patently racist.
Yeah, of course. But anyway, my point would be, I think that there's a meta story here. I think they can't fend off the vaccine injury story any longer. And so they're going to try to control the magnitude of our understanding.
Yep.
And they can't really protect us from reality with respect to ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and other repurposed drugs. That story is also beginning to break. But it is interesting that the lab leak is going in the other direction. And the reason that I think that's interesting is because this is speculation on my part. But if COVID is a lab leak and the vaccines were not safe and effective, there were drugs that were safe and effective that we weren't allowed to use, and the drugs that we were allowed to use were dangerous in their own right. And all of those things come from the same people, right? There's something very powerful about being able to say, well, person X was injured, and you can have a debate. Was it the vaccine or was it COVID, right? Well, the answer is it depends what you're analyzing. But at one level, this is Team Fauci's fault either way, right? The pathogen emerges from a lab that Fauci was fueling, and the vaccine campaign emerges from the same team. And so that, I think, is a prospect that they are trying to dodge. They do not want an analysis that says, here are all the people who were hurt downstream of COVID, right? Whether it's lockdowns, masks, vaccines, the pathogen itself,
mandated
the drugs,
closures.
Yeah. Any of those harms all comes from the same people. And that means that at some level, you know, yes, it's important to figure out what the various mechanisms of action are, but not with respect to figuring out who's to blame. So I wonder if we're not watching, if there wasn't a whiteboard somewhere or a PowerPoint presentation that explained, here's what we're going to do to all of these stories, and we're going to create a new master narrative in which, once again, the people responsible are able to escape.